first we start with a look back into the history of the banking systems of the two countries. And I have now the honor to introduce our first speaker, who is Clemens Jobst. Where is he? There he comes. Esteemed colleague from University of Vienna, where he held the chair of economic and social history. He has, I wouldn't say French background, but he has links to France because he has a doctorate from Sciences Po Paris for 2007, and he's a very well-known expert in the history of European banking systems, if I may say so, also in a comparative way, and he will tell us about the evolution of the national banking systems in Germany and France in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Clemens, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Etwa 20 Minuten.
Genau. Bon, alors apparemment c'est une bonne tradition de commencer en français, au moins quelques mots. Donc aussi, mesdames, messieurs, c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui. I was asked to present in 20 minutes or 25 minutes a relatively long history of two banking systems, which is quite a challenging task. And in the introductory remarks by Philippe ODDO and Mr. Klaus already, there was already alluded to the interplay or the interactions between the two banking systems. However, in academic research, there has long been a tradition, and there still is a tradition of writing financial history in basically national containers. Like history more generally, it's the history of France, the history of Germany, the history of Austria, and so it's the history of these national systems. And that's also how you find in the program the idea of the comparison of the French and the German banking systems. And this literature, if it's moving on the international level, then usually does comparisons, looks for commonalities, looks for differences, tries to compare. So how do these different banking systems perform relative to each other? Where are the relative strengths? And some of the terms that come up frequently in this literature are the opposition of a bank-based financial system versus a market-based financial system, universal banking versus specialized banking, arm's length relationships to industry versus close relationships to borrowers. And this approach, in fact, makes a lot of sense, as banking and the financial system more generally is very much subject to national legislation, and this national legislation actually produces these differences between national systems. At the same time, however, I think it would be it's also very interesting to look at the interactions, at the mutual influences that have already been briefly mentioned, and the points of contact. But in fact, there's much less research in this domain, but I will still try to mention at least some of these points of contact. So in the following 30 minutes, what I would like to do is give a brief overview of the research on these two banking systems, sketch their main characteristics, and in the end also try to move a little bit beyond the big banks, as you see them on the slide, the Crédit Lyonnais and the Deutsche Bank, so the big joint stock banks, as especially in recent years there has been more interest in other players and the complementary roles of these other players. We've already heard about Raiffeisen, but there are others as well, and financial history has very much moved in this directions in recent years. Now, I will start this history at the end point, so at the end of the interwar period, with two laws which were passed in France and in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. And in fact, a common characteristic of banking systems in both France and Germany in the 19th century was that there was no dedicated banking law, and there was no legal definition of what a bank is. Banks operated typically under the general commercial code. Of course, there was some special legislation for banks of issue in both countries. There was special legislation for savings banks, but for all the other banks, they basically they didn't operate under specific rules as they do nowadays. This is a very important implication because it means that the differences that we see between the banking structure in these countries is not primarily, at least, due to legal differences between the countries, but has to be explained by broader political and economic factors. A second implication, and we'll come back to that, is that it's for historians, it's not so easy to really get a grasp on the banking systems in the 19th century, because we find it difficult to count them, and we don't have that much we have no supervisory data as we have nowadays, and we always have this challenge with statistical data that we have to think about. Okay, what are actually these institutions which are labeled as banks in this relative period? It's not like today, where it's very clear, where the bank supervisors have a very clear definition and understanding what a bank is. Now, this first banking legislation, the Kreditwesengesetz in Germany and the Loi du 13 Juin 41 in France, it's quite interesting that they both happened in a period of Nazi rule and in the collaborationist regime at the same time. And this raises, of course, the question of whether there was some influence of Germany on France during this time. And the literature thinks that it is, in fact, that the French law was, in fact, of a French initiative, and that they both resulted from a general tendency of this period, also as a kind of lessons from the big financial crises of the 1930s, that banks in some sort needed to be regulated. However, what it's probably the case is that the German occupation has speeded up the process of legislation in France as the French banking system tried to protect and safeguard itself against possible measures by the occupier. In both cases as well, this legislation was kept after 1945, and in the case of France, it was even augmented by the nationalization of banks, and I guess that Alexis Strach is going to talk a little bit about that in the following. In any case, for both countries, these laws marked basically the end of a long liberal age in banking legislation, of a period basically where there was no regulation at all. And I will now move to the beginning of this period. And there again, we find a sort of a common point of departure. Both France and Germany were industrializing in the mid-19th century. Railroads were built. This increased the need for larger companies, larger financing, the heavy industry, and right at the middle of the 19th century, we find in both countries new larger banks being founded. And one of the famous names is the Crédit Mobilier in France and the Darmstädter in Germany. And there's a discussion on to what extent the Crédit Mobilier has influenced the foundation of the Darmstädter. It seems that the Darmstädter more goes back to German examples, the Schaffhausener Bank from 1848. But in both cases, we see quite similar debates. The one is on the relationship between these new banks and the governments. So the governments, on the one hand, want to further industrial growth. At the same time, they're afraid of very powerful new players. At the same time, they need access to financing for their own deficits, especially after the revolution of 1948. And these are very similar debates in both Prussia and France at the time. Another question that comes up in both countries is the relationship to the old banks, to the Privatbank in Germany, to the Haute Bank in France. And in both cases, we find the sort of kind of growing in of these old banks into these new banks. So they see them as competitors. At the same time, they co-opt these ideas and become co-founders. And we have actually one of these persons on the slide, Abraham Oppenheim, who was both one of who came from a very old banking family and who was both involved in the creation of the Crédit Mobilier and of the Darmstädter Bank in Germany. It's therefore not too surprising that we see quite a similar clustering of bank foundations in both countries. The first sort of modern joint stock banks. Banks used to be partnerships with unlimited liability. The first joint stock companies with limited liability in both countries appeared, if we exclude Bavaria in 1935, but more or less appeared around the revolution of 1948, and in both cases they resulted from a financial crisis. So the Schaffhausener Bank was created in order to deal with the crisis of 1948, and the same is true of the Comptoir d'Escompte in Paris, which was also created to deal with the financial crisis in Paris. So it's difficult to say that these were really new creations for industrial expansion. We come closer to what really were these new banks if we move on to the 50s, where we see the Crédit Immobilier in France and a couple of banks created in Germany. The Darmstädter I've already mentioned. Another one would be one of the predecessors of where we are here, the Berliner Handelsgesellschaft. In both countries as well, we see changes in legislation which have a deep impact on banking, and this is a liberalization of law of incorporation. So before incorporation or the creation of a joint stock company and of a joint stock bank as well required government approval, and this severely limited the development of new banks. And in both countries, in France already in the 60s and in Germany in 1870, these laws were significantly loosened, and we see big new banks coming up. In France, it's the Crédit Lyonnais and the Société Générale, which we still have today. And in Germany, Deutsche Bank, for instance. Again, the big players that we still have nowadays. So these were the big banks which were the main subject in financial history from the 1960s onwards. And they were mainly seen and interpreted in the question of the history of industrialization. And a number of people, especially Gerschenkron, is associated with this kind of interpretation. They were seen as the necessary preconditions for economic development, because only these banks were able to actually assemble the amount of capital that was necessary for industrial development in the mid-19th century. It's quite interesting from this point of view that on the one hand, the German case is largely interpreted as a huge success. So it's this Universalbank in the German, which then become the model and then go on in the literature, Hilferding and Lenin, and everybody is writing about these big banks which actually run the economy, while the same banks that develop in France at the same time are rather seen from a perspective of failure for having arrived very late and having therefore hindered growth in France for a long period. We have to note that this literature from the 1960s basically had to do without good numbers on growth. So people at the time didn't really know much about how economies developed. In the meantime, we have estimates on growth, on GDP growth for the 19th century as well. And when we look there, we see that in fact this idea of a sudden break, a sudden takeoff, is not really visible in the data. So France grew already, German economy grew before the mid-19th century, and it continued to grow afterwards. So this idea that these banks were actually necessary for a significant break in development is not really borne out by this literature. In any case, this doesn't mean that these banks were not important. And for Germany, the literature developed around this idea of an Idealtyp of the Universalbank. I've plotted here how in the German literature, how often the term Universalbank is mentioned. It's actually a rather new term. It basically appears in the 20th century. People at the time spoke about first the Crédit Immobilier, but you see then the red line going down. It's very important at the beginning, but then the people in Germany speak about the so-called Kreditbanken. That's the term they use in the 19th century. And the success of this Kreditbanken comes from this Universalbankenprinzip from combining investment banking and deposit banking with the idea that the private information that can be obtained from the membership in the supervisory board, so this relationship banking is necessary, so provides the information that then helps in long-term lending and in bringing these companies to the stock exchange or helping them issuing new equity. And the other side of this information comes from running the payment services of these companies, so having a very close look at what these companies are doing at every point in time. This idea is very straightforward, and it also makes a lot of sense. Empirically, it seems to be that until the 1880s, this actually is quite a good explanation for what we see, and that banks actually had a positive impact on growth. For later periods, this then becomes less evident. So it seems that industrialization after the 1880s then relied less on these banks than it did before. While research continues on these big universal banks, there's also quite some interest now on what happens beyond these big banks. There's now quite some literature on the cooperative sector, arguing that the cooperative sector was especially important for small businesses and for farmers, so small medium enterprises. A little bit about what micro-lending would be nowadays. At the same time, the Sparkassen were also a huge sector. I mean, if you look at the chart on the right, you see that the Kreditbanken are actually never even half of the total balance sheet of all German banks. The Sparkassen are very important as well. There are many Sparkassen, so it's quite difficult to get a good grasp on what they were actually doing, but we do have some evidence here again that these also helped local economic development. And if you think that there were, of course, the big joint stock industrial enterprises, but there was also a huge sector of small and medium enterprises, which also needed financing and which is also very important for growth, then this makes a lot of sense. I'll come back to this point of the small and medium enterprises for France as well in a second. What happens now to these Crédit Mobilier type banks in France? In Germany, they become the big players, while in France, the Crédit Mobilier is liquidated in 1867, and the Société Générale and the Crédit Lyonnais, which were basically the successors, they opted basically to move out of investment banking. It's a very simplified description. And Henri Chemin, whom you can see here, who was the head of the Crédit Lyonnais, he was very obsessed with the idea that liabilities and assets have to match, so that the short-term deposits that the bank was taking in could only be invested in short-term, so basically in bills of exchange. And this is a kind of a caricatural portrait of French banking, especially as we know that both the Société Générale and the Crédit Lyonnais remained involved in investment banking, especially in foreign government debt. You see here some titles for a Russian debt that was issued by the Crédit Lyonnais, and which was one of the not so successful investments, at least after 1917. Now, how can we understand these two different trajectories? I mean, both countries were moderately backward economies. So the kind of the industrial structure was not so the kind of the needs, the finance needs were not so different. But still, we get two systems which kind of developed apart. And one of the explanations that was much advanced, especially from political scientists, is that this has nothing to do, or less to do, with the demand for credit, but more with the supply side, the liability side of these banks, and especially the access to deposits. In Germany, in this story, Germany is a country with a very weak central state. strong local and regional governments, and they try to keep deposits locally. While France, which is famously centralized, these local governments and regional governments don't exist. Savings banks, for instance, which were always on a municipal level in Germany, they were run centrally in France, and this left a huge field for the big deposit banks to attract deposits at the countryside. And this becomes very quickly visible when you look at how many branches banks had in Germany and in France. In the table, you see that even in 1910, all the big German banks had only about 100, a little bit more than 100 branches altogether, while in France the number was close to 1,000. And you also see that these branches of the Crédit Lyonnais and the Société Générale were distributed across the entire territory of France, drawing in deposits which these banks then could employ in Paris, in the Paris financial market. I would like to, I'll finish in a second, but I would like to mention also for France the banking system or the financial system other than the big banks, okay? And there's been a lot of work being done in this domain, and for France there are basically two institutions which are interesting here. The one are the notaries, and the others are the local banks. So France was always accused of being underbanked. And you look at the ratio of bank balance sheets to the GDP, it appears relatively low. But we know in the meantime that many of the functions that in other countries were performed by banks were in France performed by notaries, which actually matched savers with borrowers. Okay, it never went through a balance sheet. It was basically peer-to-peer lending, but it performed the same purpose of reallocating capital in the economy. The second element are the local banks. And these local banks in France are the Privatbanken in Germany, but there were many of them, and they persisted much longer in Germany, in France than they did in Germany. And the reason was that they didn't have to compete with the savings banks as in Germany, and they had clients that were not catered for by the big Parisian banks. And the last important point, they got support from the Bank of France. So they got a liquidity backstop for the Bank of France, which allowed them to basically serve small universal banks at the local level. And you see that here on the graph. These are the locations of local banks in France in the 1840s. And you see that they relatively well align with industrial development at the time. So here represented by steam engines. So to conclude, we see that we see basically two different forms of specialization. In France, where the large banks are specialized and the local banks basically serve as universal banks for small and medium enterprises, while in Germany, the dividing up of the market is between for-profit banks, the big for-profit banks, and a very large non-profit sector, which caters for the small and medium enterprises. To conclude, I think that looking back in history somehow relativizes this classification of market versus bank-based systems, and you see that history is always more complicated and more complex than these simple ideas. The second thing is that there's a very strong path dependency. So notaries already played in France a big role in the 17th century, and they continue to play this role in the 19th century. The local banks developed in the early 19th century. They continue to play a big role until the 20th century. But at the same time, there are also big transformations possible. And an example would be this move from the universal bank Crédit Mobilier to a more specialized banking system in the 1880s. So both is possible. And the last and final point is that it's really important not to look only at a subset of actors, like the big banks, but really to have the entire banking system in view, because this is necessary to understand the relative competitive position of these different subsectors, and to understand what their relative informational advantages, their relative competitive advantages are, which then explains why they develop the way they do. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Thanks for that great overview of the development trends in the both financial systems. I'm sure there will be questions. Who would like to start? Questions from the audience? Don't there. Fine. I think we have a micro coming up here. Thank you.
Daniela Weber, many thanks for your presentation. It would be really interesting, since we live in very different times now, to understand what the difference is in both of these continental European developments as opposed to the States, because somehow the States made it and we are trying to follow.
Well, I'm not so sure that the US banking system is probably one of the most crisis-prone and chaotic financial systems that we have in history. I mean, the US is interesting because it regulates very early on. So this is one of the big differences. We have very liberal systems in Europe, while the US system with the state banks and the national banks very early on is very heavily regulated by the governments. We see a lot of financial crises in the US in the 19th century. We see very few financial crises at the same for the same extent in Europe. So in this sense, it seems that the European banking systems for the 19th century work much better, and the foundation of the Fed in 1913 is also a response to these crises. And what the US does is sending a lot of people, so sending envoys to Europe, trying to find out why it works in Europe, and that's one of the empirical bases that we have as historians are this material collected by the National Monetary Commission, where they try to learn from the European experience, I would say.
Maybe if we will hear from the next speaker, I guess more about regulatory issues, regulation. The question, what role did the regulators or the central banks play for the development of the two systems? I mean, Banque de France is much older than Reichsbank.
Yeah.
Did that have an influence?
Well, I mean, I guess the biggest impact by the central banks at that time is the role of lender of last resort that they played, when they started to act as basically as a liquidity backstop. In France already, I've mentioned, in France really played an important role for those small local banks. So it allowed them to continue to exist and to serve as a credit provider for small and medium enterprises and for more regional enterprises. And in Germany, the argument would also be that the lending of last resort is necessary actually to move into universal banking. So in the combination of investment banking and deposit banking is so risky, or it goes along with certain risks, that it requires a liquidity backstop. And in both countries, basically, the decision was not to regulate ex ante, but to have a liquidity provision ex post.
Thank you. Is that it? Good. Yeah. There is one question here.
Thanks, Patrick Montagnier from the ECB, but previously from the Banque de France. Maybe of something which is a little bit at the last period of the 19th century, the last year of century and beginning of the 19th, between the first law organizing the Crédit Agricole and the law organizing the Banque Populaire. The intervention of the state seems to be very different in France than in Germany, effectively because even the mutual group or the cooperative group have been organized by the state, which is a little bit strange. The only mutual group which has not been organized by the state at the beginning was the Crédit Mutuel, because it's born in Alsace, at a time when Alsace was a Reich province. So that's something which is very different for the Crédit Mutuel from the other mutual groups. The other things about the central bank, maybe now we have some evidences that in fact, you're right. The central bank has always defended the local banks against the large one, the national, until the 30s. After the 30s, there is a shift in the policies followed by the central bank, when in fact the central bank has pushed the local banks to be absorbed by the largest network. Just once again to organize, it was not, at this time, it was not called the national champion, but it was in fact the reality of the game which was played by the central bank. But until the 30s, effectively, the central bank has defended and was the last resort lender for the small and local banks to defend them against the national bank for one simple reason. The P&L of the central bank was mainly made with the local banks. So that's something which is also very different when comparing to the Germany, if I have well understood, because I don't know very well the German system, but when I have tried to understand what you are saying about the two systems.
Thank you.
Well, many thanks for these additional comments. The one interesting point maybe I could add here is the different way of that the banks grew. So in France, the growth was very organic until, as you say, they start absorbing these banks, and this process of absorption starts quite earlier in Germany, where the big banks acquire the smaller ones.
Yeah, I'm very sorry that we cannot have more questions here, but we will certainly continue during the break. Thank you very much, Clemens. And we continue with the next speaker, who is Alexis Drach from Université Paris 8, Vincennes.